October 1899, the end of a century. War was in the air. Great Britain was off to fight the Boers in South Africa, and every Canadian gramophone was playing Goodbye, Dolly Gray.
Goodbye, Dolly, I must leave you, though it breaks my heart to go. Something tells me I am needed at the front to fight the foe. See the boys in blue are marching, and I can no longer stay. 'Cause I hear the bugle calling, goodbye, Dolly Gray.
Naar rechts nog!
War, the best game of all. Thousands lined up to enlist, eager to get there before the fun was all over. The British Empire was at its peak of power. Queen Victoria had reigned for 60 years. Now the great Anglo-Boer War had broken out between Britain and the Transvaal Republic in South Africa. Offers of help poured in from the colonies. Canada would send her first overseas military contingent ever. Everyone expected the war to be over in a few weeks. But the great Anglo-Boer War would drag on for almost 3 years. It would sweep across an area the size of Western Europe and reduce it to ashes. And a tiny nation of farmers would bring the world's most powerful country almost to her knees. What was the war about? The usual things: freedom, equality, gold. The Dutch-speaking Boers were descendants of the first Europeans to settle at the Cape of Good Hope in the 1600s. When the Cape became a British colony in the early 1800s, thousands of Boers trekked north to escape British control. In time, they set up 2 independent republics: the Orange Free State north of the Orange River, and the Transvaal Republic north of the Vaal River. Britain retained control of Cape Colony and Natal. Then in 1886, the world's richest gold field was discovered in the Transvaal Republic. The Boers thought their future was secure. The gold paid for the spectacular parliament buildings in the Transvaal capital of Pretoria. But the deeply religious Transvaal president, Paul Kruger, had dire forebodings.
For every ounce of that cursed metal mined in this land, the burghers of the Transvaal will pay with great drops of their and their children's blood.
British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain was secretly plotting to add the Transvaal and its gold to the British Empire. He went looking for an excuse to invade. He found it when thousands of British subjects flooded into the Transvaal to work in the gold mines. Chamberlain demanded they be given voting rights in the Boer Republic. President Kruger refused. He feared that when British workers outnumbered the Boers, they would vote to join the British colonies. The Boers would lose their precious independence. By October 1899, British troops were massing along the Transvaal borders. Thousands more were aboard ships bound for South Africa. President Kruger issued an ultimatum demanding Britain recall her troops within 48 hours. Britain refused. Inside the Parliament at Pretoria, Paul Kruger declared war on Great Britain.
We went to war against the British Empire because they threatened our lands for the gold they wanted. That's why we fought. Paul Kruger, he was pressured into it. I mean, with men like Chamberlain going for his neck, he had to issue the ultimatum to prevent all those thousands of troops on the high seas landing here in South Africa and amassing on the Transvaal border. He had no choice.
Hundreds of armed Boers now streamed into the British colony of Natal. Their aim, to drive away the British army threatening to invade the Transvaal Republic. Their destination, the military garrison town of Ladysmith. In the west, other Boers were invading British Cape Colony. They surrounded the fortified towns of Kimberley and Mafeking and seized control of Britain's Western Railway. The Boer army was made up almost entirely of volunteer farmers organized into local units called commandos. The Boers didn't wear uniforms. They were all skilled hunters who had been riding and shooting since childhood. Many carried powerful new German Mauser rifles. All the Boer generals were elected by their men. Virtually none of the Boers, including the generals, had any formal military training. Many boys of 12 and 13 fought alongside their fathers. This father took 10 sons to war. Even women often joined their men in the field. This motley collection of farmers was about to take on the most powerful army in the world. A week after war was declared, a Boer commando suddenly appeared on the top of Talana Hill, 40 miles from Ladysmith, and opened fire on the British Army camp below. The first battle of the Anglo-Boer War had begun, and so had the education of the British Army. The British Tommies charged up the hill in close formation. Dozens were mown down by a firestorm from Boer Mauser rifles. In the time-honored tradition of British officers, General Penn Simons galloped up to rally his demoralized men.
And at this wall, just in front of us, right here, he had to climb off his horse because it was too high for his horse to step over. And as he climbed over the wall, he presented a perfect target to the Boers who were dug in on the top of Talana Hill. And on this spot, where this cairn is, he was mortally wounded. He was shot in the stomach, and as he got back on his horse to go back to camp and to hospital, he encouraged his troops by saying, "Carry on, boys, I'll be out again tomorrow." The sad thing is that he wasn't out tomorrow, as he died of his wound. As the British troops neared the top of the hill, the Boers withdrew. The British found that they were being fired on by their own artillery. Some of their men were killed and lie buried here in the cemetery at the foot of the hill. The British gunners explained that from the distance, they could not tell the difference between friend and foe. This was the first battle where the British troops wore khaki uniforms, and was very similar in colouring to that worn by the Boers.
To make matters worse, the British cavalry unit sent to catch the fleeing Boers was ambushed and captured. In the first battle of the Anglo-Boer War, the British had lost 3 times as many men as the Boers. Their artillery had killed their own men, their general was dying, and their cavalrymen were on their way to Pretoria as prisoners of war. But the Boers had fled, so the British press proclaimed the Battle of Talana Hill a glorious victory. That same night, a Boer commando captured a British supply train nearby at Elandslaagte station.
As they offloaded the supplies on the train, they found a large quantity of alcoholic beverages. And so the idea for a party was born. In the station that night, they invited their British prisoners. They sang songs, they recited poetry. The British sang the Transvaal Volkslied, the Boers sang God Save the Queen. The next morning, they went back to battle. And by the end of that day, many of those men who had sung together would lie dead on that battlefield.
The Boers retired from the station and set up their guns on a nearby hilltop. General Ian Hamilton was sent against them. He was the first general to realize that it was suicide for men to charge into modern rifle fire in the traditional close-packed formation.
General Ian Hamilton told his Highlanders to advance across the field, but to stay spread out so they would be harder to hit by the Boer sharpshooters sitting on top of the hill. The Highlanders charged as the bagpipes wailed across the field of battle. But the white glistening sporrans of the Highlanders made them easy targets, and many fell. On top of the hill, the Boers fled down the back, jumped on their ponies, and rode away.
They had no idea of the horrors to come.
As the sun was going down, the Boers fled on their ponies across the plain. Suddenly, 200 British cavalrymen charged them with lances lowered and sabers flashing. Again and again they rode through the ranks of the fleeing Boers, slashing and chopping. Dozens of Boers fell. The Boers cried for mercy. They begged to surrender, but there would be no mercy on this field of battle.
Corporal Kelly speared 2 fleeing Boers at once with his lance before he himself was killed. Only the darkness put an end to the carnage. The Boers would never again allow themselves to be caught out in the open. As a result, Elandslaagte effectively ended the traditional battlefield role of the British cavalry. Sir George White, the British commander in Natal, was shaken by the strength of the Boers. He ordered all British troops to abandon the victorious battlefields of Talana and Elandslaagte and retreat to defend his headquarters at Ladysmith. The most powerful army in the world was now running in panic from men the British press depicted as backward louts. The Boers now began bombarding Ladysmith with a huge gun that was to become world famous as Long Tom.
With war looming on the horizon, President Paul Kruger and his cabinet decided upon buying the most modern weapons they could get their hands on. They bought 4 Creusot guns from the Creusot factory in France, with the main aim to protect Pretoria from a British onslaught.
British military experts were certain these guns were far too heavy to ever be moved in the field, but they had seriously underestimated the Boers.
I'm standing here alongside one of the replicas of those 4 Creusot guns. The Boers nicknamed them Long Tom because they had such a long barrel. These guns were very heavy. About 20 oxen were used to trek them through the veld, and during the war they were used to besiege the towns of Mafeking, of Kimberley, and of Ladysmith.
In Ladysmith, General White sent up his war balloon to map out the Boer positions. A war balloon was inflated with hydrogen and sent aloft from a balloon cart. It was held down by a steel cable unrolled from a windlass. Balloonists used binoculars and telescopes to spy out the Boer positions, then dropped information down in weighted envelopes. On the night of October 29th, General White launched a massive surprise attack on the Boers surrounding Ladysmith. His plan: strike a knockdown blow to crush the Boers and end the war. Instead, a firestorm from Boer Mauser rifles sent the British Army fleeing in panic back into the town. The Boers took almost 1,000 British prisoners. Not in 100 years had so many British soldiers surrendered to an enemy. The British Empire was stunned to learn that General White and 14,000 British soldiers were now trapped and besieged in Ladysmith.
The British knew the Boers could fight. They knew that there was something coming, but they did not think it was going to be such a big war right over the whole spectrum of South Africa, with all classes and all races, for 3 years long.
At Kimberley, the Boers had 50,000 people trapped inside, including Cecil Rhodes, the wealthy owner of the De Beers diamond mines. The big hole at Kimberley supplied 90% of the world's diamonds. Further north, Mafeking was cut off with 1,000 whites and 7,000 Africans trapped inside. The British commander in Mafeking was Robert Baden-Powell, who would later become the founder of the International Boy Scouts. Baden-Powell would base the uniforms and field craft of the Boy Scouts entirely on his Boer War experiences. The British Army would spend the next 6 months trying to lift the sieges and rescue the British towns of Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. Now President Steyn of the Orange Free State sent his army to help the neighboring Transvaal Republic. It was a tough decision.
My great-grandfather, he knew how powerful the British Empire was at the time just before the outbreak of the Boer War, because he practiced as an advocate in London. And he knew full well that our republic would be doomed if we joined Transvaal in the fight for independence against Great Britain. But he said, I'd rather lose the independence of the Free State with honor than retain it with dishonor. So therefore, we were sucked into the war.
And 15,000 kilometers away, so was the Dominion of Canada. On October 30th, 1,000 members of the Royal Canadian Regiment marched on board the Sardinian at Quebec. Thousands cheered, whistles shrieked, and the ship steamed away to South Africa carrying the first Canadian military contingent ever sent to an overseas war. Frederick Borden, Canada's Minister of Militia, declared,
"The dispatch of the gallant 1,000 is the voice of Canada, announcing it is no longer a colony, but a mature nation of the Empire."
Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier reminded the Canadians,
"You are going to South Africa not to stamp out Dutch nationality, but to establish liberty, civil rights and religious freedom."
Canadians of British stock demanded that Canada send troops to show loyalty to Britain. But the Anglo-Boer War was already tearing Canadian society apart.
99% of French Canadians detest this war.
French Canadians opposed Canadian participation. They sympathized with the Boers as fellow victims of British imperialism. They saw the Boers as a minority like themselves who only wanted to be left alone to protect their own language and religion. As a French Canadian, Prime Minister Laurier was against sending Canadians to fight in South Africa, but his loyalty to Britain made him change his mind. Canadians had fought overseas before, but always in British uniforms, in the ranks of British units. In fact, over 150 graduates of the Royal Military College at Kingston were to serve as officers in British units fighting in South Africa. But Laurier now insisted that for the first time Canada would send an identifiably Canadian regiment with Canadian uniforms commanded by Canadian officers. Lieutenant Colonel William Otter was named commanding officer. Otter was probably Canada's senior military officer. He had served in the Fenian raids and helped put down the Riel Rebellion. The Royal Canadian Regiment, an infantry unit of 1,000 volunteers, would become Canada's first contingent. They all had one great fear, that the war would be over before they got there. Of the 1,000 recruits aboard ship, only 10 had ever been under fire. Colonel Otter began a strict training routine of drill and rifle practice. And the grinding stones never stopped sharpening bayonets and swords for the upcoming fight with the Boers.
For the first time in a war, the railway lines played a decisive part. For the British, this was the only way of communicating. It was the only way of getting their forces, the troops, ammunition, food, whatsoever, to the front. The Boers knew this, and what they did was sabotaging the railway lines.
To counter the Boer attacks, the British were forced to put thousands of soldiers on railway patrol. In fact, for the first time in history, guarding railway bridges, tracks, and stations would be the only action that the bulk of the army would ever see. The man in charge of all British railway operations in South Africa was a French-Canadian, Lieutenant Colonel Percy Girouard. The former altar boy from St. Hyacinthe, Quebec, had performed brilliantly as the British Army's transport officer during the war in the Sudan. Now, at the age of 33, this French-Canadian was director of all the railways in South Africa. To protect their supply lines, the British developed the armored train. This steel-plated battleship of the veldt was made up of a powerful engine and several boxcars made of thick steel plate. Some engines, like Hairy Mary, were covered with naval hawser to protect them from gunfire. Most were covered with heavy armor plate. Powerful searchlights were used to spot Boer saboteurs at night. Boxcars bristled with scores of riflemen who could fire from slits in the sides. The men who rode the armored trains called them death traps. The trains could easily be derailed by rocks on the track or torn up rails, so the engine was always placed in the middle of the train, with boxcars to the front and back to absorb the shock of any unexpected collision. The enemy could shoot right down into the boxcars, which had to be roofless. Otherwise, the men would suffocate from the acrid fumes from dozens of rifles and machine guns firing in a small space. The men climbing into this armored train in Natal could not guess that within hours many of them would lie dead, but their train would be world famous. On board was a young war correspondent named Winston Churchill.
Armored trains became an obvious target for Boer commandos. Their most famous attack took place right here, just outside Freer. On the morning of November the 15th, a Boer patrol watched an armored train pass on its daily run to Colenso. They piled rocks on the track behind me at the bottom of a hill and waited. When the train came back, the Boers opened fire. The engineer sped up down the hill, came around the curve, hit the rocks, and derailed his train.
Boer artillery had shredded the armor plate like paper. The boxcars had been designed to protect the soldiers from rifle bullets, not artillery shells. Churchill rallied the soldiers to hold off the Boers until the engine could carry the wounded to safety. Churchill and the others were all captured and locked up in this building, which still stands in Pretoria. Churchill's heroics and subsequent escape from the Boers made him world famous. Later, he returned to the wreck site to have this picture taken. Those who died still lie here at the site of the ambush. Six weeks after the war began, a British army of 12,000 men under Lord Methuen marched north from Orange River Station to cross the Modder River and rescue the besieged town of Kimberley. What Methuen's army was to experience would send shockwaves throughout the British Empire and change forever the nature of warfare. The Boers waited on hilltops to try to stop the British advance. In each battle, the British overran the Boers and drove them off the hill, but suffered extremely heavy losses. The Boers fled on horseback, and the frustrated British infantry had no way to pursue them.
The Boers, because they were not trained soldiers in the traditional sense of the word, took up defensive positions. But once they thought that they were going to be defeated, they actually left the battlefield as soon as possible. Now, this was not really according to the rules of battle in the European sense of the word.
The Boers' new Mauser rifles were powerful and accurate over distances unknown in previous wars. And they used preloaded clips of 5 bullets that could be quickly slipped into the rifle magazines. The older-style British Lee Metfords held 10 bullets to start, but once fired off became slow-shooting single shots because bullets had to be loaded one at a time. In the same motion it took a British Tommy to load 1 bullet, a Boer using a clip could load 5. The Boers could unleash a firestorm. And with the new smokeless powder used by the Mausers, the Tommies couldn't even see where the fire was coming from. Old-style guns had always used black powder, which covered traditional battlefields with dense clouds of smoke. The hiding place of a rifleman or gunner who used black powder could easily be located on a hill. He could then be silenced. The appearance of smokeless powder changed the nature of warfare. This Maxim machine gun shows how much smoke it produced when using old-fashioned black powder, and how little when the same gun used the new smokeless cordite. The battlefield diaries of British Tommies are full of complaints of never seeing a Boer that they could shoot at. From the top of this hill, Methuen's signal corps used a heliograph to alert Kimberley that his army would be there just as soon as it crossed the Modder River. The heliograph used a system of mirrors to send flashes of Morse code during sunny weather. At the Modder River, Boer General de la Rey planned a surprise for the British. His men waited in trenches hidden in the long grass of the riverbank. Methuen's scouts failed to discover them. When the British advanced to cross the river, hundreds were mown down by Boer sharpshooters. During the night, the Boers pulled back to the Magersfontein Hills, just a few miles north of the river. The tragic events that would soon unfold here would make Magersfontein famous around the world. After a month at sea, the first Canadian contingent landed at Cape Town in South Africa. The newspapers were ecstatic.
As they neared the landing place, the steamships whistled and the crowd shouted themselves hoarse. The Canadians, filled with the spirit of their country and the Empire, burst into a rousing chorus, and the Maple Leaf Forever rang out over Table Bay.
The Royal Canadian Regiment marched through Cape Town.
Never before did such a gigantic throng of people gather in the streets. They greeted the men off to the front with volley after volley of cheers. The city was moved as never before. This is the finest body of men that has yet come here. They have a light, springy, devil-may-care sort of swagger.
The next day, the Canadians traveled north by train through the scrubby Karoo. At Orange River Station, Colonel Otter learned that Lord Methuen needed reinforcements for his march to Kimberley.
Barely a week after landing in South Africa, the Royal Canadians found themselves here at Orange River Station. They were standing behind the station house here in the hot, broiling sun, while inside Colonel Otter and Larry Buchan, his second in command, were arguing loudly. Colonel Otter had been invited to send the Royal Canadians to the front lines, but Larry Buchan said no, the men are too green, they need more training. The argument went on all afternoon. Finally, Colonel Otter agreed with Buchan. Instead, the Gordon Highlanders were sent to the front line. By this small twist of fate, the Canadians were to miss the massacre at Magersfontein.
Within days, the British Empire would be reeling in shock over what would become known as Black Week. In the Magersfontein Hills, two Boer generals had been arguing about how to meet Lord Methuen's next attack. Their decision would make military history.
General Cronje said that the Boers should position themselves all along the mountainside of Magersfontein, whereas General De La Rey said, no, let's put our men in front in trenches. These trenches, which I'm standing in now, were about 100 to 200 meters in front of the Magersfontein Hills. General De La Rey knew that the British forces were used to bombarding the hills in which the Boers were supposed to be, and then they would follow that up with an infantry attack. That's the reason why he decided upon digging trenches in front of the Magersfontein Hills.
De La Rey constructed barbed wire entanglements to protect his trench lines. It would be the first time barbed wire was ever used on a battlefield. Lord Methuen had a war balloon to spy out the enemy positions, but he was so sure the Boers would be in their usual place on top of the hills that he chose not to use it. For hundreds of British Highlanders, it would prove to be a fatal mistake. On December the 10th, Methuen unleashed one of the heaviest artillery barrages ever seen in warfare upon the top of the Magersfontein Hills. British shells were using a new high explosive called lyddite, reputed to kill every living thing within 150 yards of a strike. At midnight, General Andrew Wauchope led his Highland Brigade off across 6 miles of scrubby veldt towards Magersfontein. Their job? To finish off any Boers who had escaped being pulverized by the lyddite shells.
3,500 men are tightly packed into an area the size of 1.5 football fields. On the outside are men holding on to ropes to keep the group together. In the front, Major Benson is leading the way. Tonight, in total darkness, he's finding his way by using his compass.
The Highlanders did not know that the Boers were safe in their trenches in front of the hills, and only 3 had been killed. But the bombardment had tipped them off to be ready for an attack that night.
Imagine yourself in this trench during the Battle of Magersfontein. There they lay, father, brother, son, nephew, next to each other. Hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers in this trench, northwards, southwards, all lying here. They were ordinary farmers protecting the independence. They were not professional soldiers, but here they lay on the morning of the 11th of December 1899. As they looked up over the trench over here, as dawn broke, they saw the veldt swarming with British soldiers.
Just before dawn, the Highland Brigade reaches this position. Major Benson turns to General Wauchope and suggests now would be a good time to spread the men out across the field, so they would be poorer targets for the Boer sharpshooters on Magersfontein Hill. The general replies, just a few more minutes. Then a shot from the trenches and a fusillade of rifle fire sweeps the field and into the Highlanders, still standing, packed like sardines. They go down by the scores. One of the first to fall mortally wounded on this spot, General Wauchope. His last words to his men, boys, don't blame me for this.
When the British charged the trenches, they got hopelessly snagged in the barbed wire.
The accursed wires caught them round the legs until they floundered like trapped wolves. And all the time, the rifles of the foe sang the song of death in their ears.
By 6 a.m., thousands of terrified Tommies lay pinned down behind anthills and bushes as Mauser fire played over their heads. On that day, a Canadian doctor won a Victoria Cross for helping the wounded while under heavy fire. Lieutenant Harry Manning Douglas was a graduate of Queen's University and was serving in the British Army. By the end of the day, the British had lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. The Boers had lost far fewer and were masters of the field. Lord Methuen ordered a retreat. The Times history of the war was to call General de la Rey's defensive tactics at Magersfontein one of the boldest and most original conceptions in the history of war. Only 4 days later in Natal, the British commander-in-chief himself decided to tackle the Boers. General Redvers Buller had served in Canada during the Riel Rebellion and had won a Victoria Cross in the Zulu Wars. Now he planned to lift the siege of Ladysmith. Buller planned to force his way across the Tugela River at Colenso, where the Boers had blown up the railway bridge. Then he would break through a line of hills held by the Boers on the north bank. Opposing him was General Louis Botha, an amiable 37-year-old Boer farmer with no military training, in his first command. Botha set up dummy guns in fake trenches on the hilltops to fool the British war balloons. Then he hid his men in camouflaged trenches on the slopes lower down. Botha left the road bridge over the Tugela River standing to entice the British to cross here. Botha's men would hold their fire until all the British were across. Then the Boers would open fire and annihilate the British trapped between the river and the Boer trenches. For 2 days, Buller bombarded the dummy trenches on the hilltop, but the Boers remained silent, safely hidden lower down. On December 15th, from high on a ridge, Boer General Louis Botha watched the advance of the biggest British army to march into battle in half a century. General Buller ordered Colonel C.J. Long's artillery unit to cover the infantry attack across the Colenso Bridge. Buller warned Long to keep his guns well back from the river, out of range of enemy rifles. But Long disobeyed. He believed artillery should be pushed right into the face of the enemy to destroy him at close range. Long galloped his guns to within 300 yards of the river.
I'm on the line where Colonel Long stopped the mad dash of his artillery towards the Boer lines. The stone blocks show where each of the guns was set up on the morning of the battle. Now, Colonel Long had taken a wild gamble that would prove to be disastrous. By galloping his guns to this position, he was far ahead of the British infantry and had left his gunners completely without protection as they brought their guns to bear against the Boers. As well, his men were now easy targets for the Boer sharpshooters who were only a few hundred yards to the front.
Louis Botha watched in astonishment. Firing on Long now would give away the Boer positions and wreck his battle plan. But Long's guns were now so close they could pulverize the Boers. Botha had no choice. He signaled, and a storm of Boer bullets swept across the Tugela and into Long's gunners. Most of Long's 72 artillery horses fell immediately. Soon, a third of Long's gunners lay dead or wounded. The survivors had to abandon the guns.
General Buller ordered that the guns be rescued. 10 men leapt on fresh horses and came riding up the gully to the guns that stood where these 2 stone pillars are today. Amid a hail of Boer bullets, they managed to hitch up 2 guns and gallop back down the gully to the safety of the British lines. But so many men and horses were shot down in the rescue attempt, the other 10 guns had to be abandoned to the Boers.
When we saw another lot of men and more teams dash to save the guns, we held our breath. It was madness. Nothing could live there. Then came another lot, and another, and another. I was sick with horror that such bravery should be so useless. God, I turned away and could not look. And yet I had to look again. It was too wonderful.
7 Victoria Crosses would be awarded for the heroic acts that took place on this small piece of ground.
General Buller ordered a retreat. His army had lost 10 guns and over 1,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. The Boers had lost only 40.
Shall we meet beyond the river?
The week of horrific defeats at Colenso and Magersfontein sent a shock wave through the British Empire. It would forever be known as Black Week.
If England is crushed, Canada is lost. No sacrifice we can make will be too great. This is our war.
Even French Canadians were rallying to the cause. Britain was now calling for mounted troops. Canada would send a second contingent. It would have 3 batteries of Royal Canadian Artillery with 18 guns and 540 men. There would also be 750 horsemen in 2 battalions of Canadian Mounted Rifles, one from the east and one from the west. Every small town cheered on its local hero.
Captain Mackey is a splendid specimen of Canadian manhood and as fine a looking officer as one could wish to see. He stands 6'3" in height and straight as an arrow, and when mounted on his magnificent charger is a sight sufficient to make any girl's heart flutter. He was escorted to the station by almost the entire population of Pembroke.
Militia Minister Frederick Borden was especially pleased at the chance to field test the artillery, the pride and joy of the Canadian militia. He was not so pleased that his only son, a medical student at McGill University, had also enlisted. "Where is the son of the Minister of Militia?" the Halifax Herald had barked when the first contingent set sail 2 months earlier. Now, against his father's advice, Harold Borden, a lieutenant in the militia, was off to the wars. Meanwhile, in Africa, the 1st Canadian contingent languished at a huge training camp at Belmont. Colonel Otter was made commandant of the camp. His men complained that he was trying to impress the British authorities with paperwork instead of leading them into action. As the weeks went by, many regretted ever volunteering for service in Africa.
We're at the railway station in Belmont. The Canadians were stuck here doing railway patrol for 2 whole months. This was a door to their guard room during that time. Daily they watched trains taking troops to the front and bringing wounded and prisoners back, reminding them, of course, that while others were getting action, they were bored and stuck in Belmont. A constant reminder must have been the bullet holes here in the side of the station wall, made during the Battle of Belmont 2 weeks before the Canadians arrived, which reminded them that there was action elsewhere while they were stuck here on train patrol.
Today, you can still see the scratchings made by the bored Canadians on the rocks on top of Gun Hill. George Downey, Montreal. W.R. Lawrence, Cornwall. A. Woodward, B Company, London. W. Burns, London. N. Clough, D Company, Ottawa. One of the few pleasant distractions was bathing in the tank that supplied the camp with its drinking water.
The Canadian hospital at Belmont is still standing. The regiment's first fatality in Africa, M.C. Chappell, died in this building from tonsillitis. 2 other men were to die of enteric fever, probably from dirty drinking water that they had gotten at Orange River Station. Ultimately, in fact, more Canadians were to die of enteric fever in Africa than were ever to die from Boer bullets.
But Canadians were already dying in battle. Lieutenant Wood of Halifax had been killed at the Battle of Belmont while serving with the British Lancashire Regiment. Canadian officers helped to pay for his headstone. The only bright spot was Queen Victoria's Christmas gift to her South African troops, a tin of chocolate. Canadian Private Jackson sent his home to his father.
It is too good to keep here. There is such a demand for them as mementos. Somebody might take a fancy to it, so you will readily understand why I am sending mine home. Take good care of it until I return in a few months.
But Private Jackson would never see his chocolate tin, his father, or Canada again. The Royal Canadian Regiment would soon be caught up in Canada's biggest and most tragic military action in almost 100 years.